Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. Korea has been, for the past 70 years, a country divided. Its northern border is perhaps the longest militarized stretch of real estate on the planet. Some call it the last outpost of the Cold War. Across the line is North Korea, a rogue state with its borders patrolled by heavily armed Cold War-style guards. What is the future of the Korean Peninsula? Here to discuss it with us is someone in a position to know. He is Colonel Clint Highnote, United States Air Force, who most recently served as the commander of the 8th Fighter Wing in Kunsong Air Base, South Korea. Clint, we're honored to have you with us, and thank you so much for your service.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. It's great to be here with you and to discuss the Korean Peninsula on a pretty day in Manhattan.
Yes, that's right. Now, Korea and Manhattan. Now, let's start with the U.S. piece. The U.S. military has about 29,000 troops there. They've been stationed there for about 65 or 75 years. What are we trying to accomplish, and how long do you expect that will remain?
Well, as you know, we have an alliance with the Korean people, so that would be the Republic of Korea, what we know as South Korea. And the number of troops that we're required to station there due to the alliance is 28,500. So we go up and down a few hundred at a time as we rotate troops out. We also put additional units that rotate through. So right now there's a fighter unit that's rotating through one of the Air Force bases there. So what do we do with all of those troops? And the answer, when I used to go and welcome all of our new people into our base at Kunsong, Korea, I would tell them, you are here to deter. You're here to make sure that the North doesn't come south. You're here to keep the peace. And if you look and see what our record has been since the end of the Korean Civil War, we've kept the peace. And what that has done is it's created space, and that space has been used by the people of Korea, wonderful people who had nothing at the end of the Civil War. And what they were able to do is they were able to take that space, that peace that we were able to provide for them, the umbrella of security, and they have used it to great effect to basically rebuild their entire nation, their economy, their educational structure, their infrastructure, their military. All of it has become, what we've seen is we've seen an incredible advance. In fact, some people call it the miracle on the Han, after the river that runs through the middle of Seoul. And so I would argue that our military alliance has been incredibly successful because it has kept the peace. That peace has allowed the Korean people to flourish, and they've really taken advantage.
Now, you were my traveling companion on a recent trip to Seoul, and we met four-star General Curtis Scaparrotti, who's in charge of, I think he wears three hats, the UN force there, the U.S. force there, and the combined U.S.
That's exactly
Korean force.
He has many jobs.
Now, he told us that he's 24/7 ready to fight. And why does it require such a high level of preparedness?
Well, so it's a great question, and in fact, the phrase, General Scaparrotti was at one time my boss, and he's the boss of all the U.S. people over in the, or all the U.S. military people over.
Boss of bosses.
He is the boss of bosses, and a wonderful leader. And what he and everyone else over there used to say, or the phrase that we used was, we need to be ready to fight tonight. The original Korean Civil War was kicked off by a nighttime raid into Seoul from the North Koreans into the South. And the truth is that we weren't very ready, we being the alliance between us and what was the South Koreans. And ever since then, what we believe is the best way to keep the peace is to be prepared for war. And that takes an extreme amount of discipline, of practice and training, and it takes really a mindset, and that mindset is you have to be ready at any time in case something were to happen. And what we have seen on the Korean Peninsula is provocations can occur quickly without warning, and you never know when you wake up the morning what might come that day. And so for the entire time that I was a commander of one of our 2 Air Force bases over in Korea, what I had to do was get myself into the mindset that I might have to lead my people to go fight. And then I'd have to get my subordinate leaders into that mindset. And we would all together as a team try to get the entire team ready to go. And so every day, that's what we thought about. Even on the weekends, on the holidays, we always thought about what it would take to keep the peace. And we felt like the best way to do that was to be prepared to go to war at any time.
Hamlet said the readiness is all.
Right.
So we have, in addition, as an aspect of readiness, military exercises.
Yes.
And there was something we just concluded called Operation Key Resolve.
That's right.
And maybe you can tell us a little about the nature of the exercises and also what is our encounter with the North Koreans when we perform these exercises?
Well, the exercise schedule drives a lot of the calendar throughout the year. And there's a really good reason for that. So we just concluded an exercise called Key Resolve. We're right now in the middle of an exercise called Foal Eagle. So this is our springtime set of exercises. Key Resolve is meant to test our leadership, our ability to command and control. So it's basically what we would call a command post exercise, where we're sending orders and messages back and forth among the different headquarters, but we're not moving too many troops around. We're not doing a lot of shooting in the field or practicing that way. And then after that part is concluded and we've kind of talked through what we would do if we had to execute the war plans, we get a chance to actually move the troops around and fly airplanes and do exercises. And that's happening right now with Foal Eagle. And they're doing all sorts of things over there. They've brought in some extra troops from the United States. They're training side by side with the Korean forces. In fact, recently they conducted a practice amphibious landing on the east coast of Korea. So that's a very interesting thing. We don't get to do a lot of practicing of amphibious landings, but that's happening right now. The exercise schedule is very closely coordinated so that we think the North Koreans would be most ready to attack, we're most ready to defend. So why is that? The North Koreans have a cycle in the way that they do business. In the summertime, they're very worried about planting and harvesting crops. In the wintertime, they're very worried about getting enough food to eat and also quite a bit of construction going on. In the spring and the fall are when the North Koreans do a very big training cycle. So they'll have a springtime training cycle and a fall training cycle. And what we have determined over the years is the best way to counter that, the best way to make sure that we deter during that time, is when they are most ready, we need to be most ready, and we do that through this set of exercises. So the biggest exercises are one in the spring and one in the fall. We're in the springtime one right now. It should wrap up within the next couple of weeks.
Now, every time we announce an exercise, the North Koreans respond with either some threat, or they test a nuclear weapon, or they shoot rockets and missiles, or they do something terribly provocative. After the Operation Key Resolve, our ambassador in South Korea, whom we met, Mark Lippert,
yes,
was the victim of a slashing attack, and he was very seriously injured. Do you connect the two, that every time we do an exercise, they retaliate in some way?
Well, I absolutely believe that the reason why North Korea does some of these provocations during the spring and the fall is because they are answering. They are trying to look strong in the face of what they feel is a provocative exercise amongst the allies in the South. And that has occurred for years. I don't expect that it's going to change. In fact, I think over the weekend they shot 4 rockets or missiles, and that's to be expected. I think we expect more before this exercise season is over. And that is a fairly normal way of doing business on the Korean Peninsula. I do think the attack on Ambassador Lippert was abnormal, in that the person that did it was obviously a sympathizer of North Korea and someone who is very committed to seeing reconciliation between the two.
Between the two countries, North Korea and South Korea.
And South Korea. Yet the way that he has gone about that in the past has been violent. Unfortunately, he had committed a violent act in the past, and for some reason he was allowed to get close to our ambassador. And as you know, our ambassador, Mark Lippert, is very accessible to the Korean people. In fact, he's made a habit of walking to work every morning with his dog. And the Korean people love that. And so far, the Korean people have fallen in love with Ambassador Lippert. And especially after the attack, the way that he handled it, the way that he reached out to the Korean people to let them know that it was okay, and then in fact it increased his resolve for better relations between the countries, our country and South Korea. I think Ambassador Lippert handled that with a level of class and dignity that's to be commended for sure.
Yes, we should be very proud of him.
We are. But I think that I don't see a real connection between the exercises or maybe a North Korean provocation. I think this was one person operating in a vacuum.
Well, let's talk about North Korea. What kind of country is it? It appears to be a rogue state. Its leader, Kim Jong-un, is this weird-looking kind of guy. He's very unpredictable, very unreliable, and he has a nuclear arsenal. What's to be made of North Korea, and how do we do something to pacify them?
North Korea is like no country on earth right now, probably the most isolated country in the world. And Kim Jong-un, its leader, a very young man, is not someone that has earned a lot of trust throughout the world. I think there's some very interesting things that are going on with North Korea. First of all, just understanding, as a percentage, it has the highest amount of people who serve in its military. So over 1 million people actively serving in its military. What that has driven the regime to do is to have, for years, a military-first policy. And what that means is that the military has the first call on the meager resources in North Korea. So, for example, they have higher food rations, or they have the first access to fuel if fuel gets scarce. In order for that to be sustained over time, what the leaders have had to do is to stoke up this perpetual fear about the South, and especially about the United States and what we might do to provoke North Korea. So it's kind of the opposite of the way that we view them. And so they're constantly stoking this fear and hatred of what is going on, especially of the United States and our military forces over in South Korea. And so this is a situation that has been tense for many, many years. I don't see that tension going away. What has changed ever since Kim Jong-un took power in the death of his father, after the death of his father, is that
after he killed his uncle.
Well, I was going to get to that. I think there is a major change going on, and the reason is because Kim Jong-un is young. The society in North Korea, in China, in South Korea still has many Confucian undertones where age and experience is still highly respected. If you look at the Communist Party in China, you'll see that. There are no young men who are leading the Communist Party in China.
President Xi is certainly not a young man.
He is not. And they are used to dealing with people about that same age. And what they have seen over in North Korea is that there's a young leader. And when this young leader took the one man who was seen as maybe the moderating force and certainly the liaison between the North Korean regime and the Chinese Communist Party, who was Kim Jong-un's uncle. And of course, what Kim Jong-un did was had his uncle executed. Well, that created a very high tension between the Chinese government, the Chinese leadership, and the leadership in North Korea. I don't think we've seen that relationship repaired yet. In fact, there's a very high level of distrust between the two now. And I think China feels like the leverage that they may have enjoyed at one time over the Kim regime is not the way that it is right now with the young leader. I think that has China rattled when it comes to North Korea. But I think, and also, they don't know what else to do. They are very skeptical of what might happen with a reunified Korea. And they're skeptical with an increased presence of the United States on the Korean Peninsula. That would be against their interest. They don't want to see more U.S. troops or more U.S. weapons on Korean Peninsula. And so they're very skeptical about what might happen the day after, say, a warming between the North and the South. So they're kind of caught between this rock and this hard place. They've got a leader that they're not quite sure what to expect, and he's shown himself to be quite unpredictable. But at the same time, they've got the fear of the aftermath in the wake of a reunification and what that might look like. So they're kind of playing the status quo right now, and that's why we see the six-party talks, which are the talks that were supposed to discuss a way of getting rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons, of how to basically go back to a non-proliferation regime on the Korean Peninsula. They've basically stalled out. Not a whole lot going on anymore with those. And so as we go forward, it's hard to see where any progress is being made. And certainly President Park is trying to open up some progress, but right now it's certainly on the nuclear front, not a lot of progress.
President Park of South Korea, who has made reunification the centerpiece of her policies, and she has about 3 more years to serve, I think. Now, between the two countries is the demilitarized zone, which we visited.
That's right.
And that is policed on the northern frontier by very formidable-looking North Korean guards in uniforms that are reminiscent of the Cold War in the 1950s.
Yes.
Now, have there been incidents in the demilitarized zone?
There are almost continuous incidents in the demilitarized zone. It's a place where the tension is so thick you can cut it with a knife, as you experienced on the day that we went to visit. And that is the way it is all the time there. So there are continually provocations or incidents or misunderstandings that happen along that highly militarized and very tense zone in between the two countries.
With little communication between the two parties.
Almost no communication. In fact, the small village, Panmunjom, where we went to go see the demilitarized zone, is one of the only places where there is communication that could occur between North and South. And every once in a while, we're able to actually get some communication going. But there are many days when we'll pick up the phone and try to call over just to test the lines, and they won't even pick up the phone.
Or we send a letter and it isn't picked up.
That's exactly right. There's a mailbox that's actually filling up. In fact, I think it's quite full right now because the North Koreans have not accepted any of the letters that we have tried to provide as required by the armistice that exists between the two countries.
Now, you said that North Korea has about 1 million individuals in uniform.
Yes.
And South Korea has what, about 635,000?
Yes, a little bit over 600,000.
And there's we saw, actually, North Korea has installed an array of artillery emplacements.
Yes.
And with these conventional weapons, they could destroy downtown Seoul. Isn't that right? Before we could even get started with some kind of retaliatory attack.
So one of the reasons that we believe that we have to have such a high level of readiness to deter North Korea is, in some ways, North Korea has the capital city, Seoul, hostage. It is able to hold it hostage because it has these long-range artillery pieces that can reach, some of the long-range artillery can reach all the way into the center of Seoul. And Seoul, of course, is the capital city, just like Washington, D.C. And think about what it would be like if there were artillery pieces in Maryland that were able to reach into the center of our capital city at any point in time with no warning. And that's the situation that the Seoulites live in day to day, and they do a marvelous job of going on with their lives, living it at the end of the barrel of a gun,
building their economy,
and going to church and hanging out with their family and walking along the Han River and taking bike rides. They live a happy life under the threat of North Korea at all times.
There's been a new military system that's been proposed by the United States, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System,
yes.
THAAD.
Yes.
Everything in the military is an acronym.
Of course.
tell us about THAAD and
Sure.
what's going on there.
Well, I'll correct you just because it is important in the diplomacy. We have not formally proposed the deployment of a system called THAAD. And you did a good job of talking about, I'm not sure I could even say the acronym or what it means. But what it really is think of it as a high-altitude missile defense system. So it would be the umbrella under which you could protect most of the Korean Peninsula. We do not have that today. What we have are a series of medium-altitude defense systems. You've probably heard of them called Patriot. We have many of these Patriot batteries that are strung together throughout the South. They're ready at a moment's notice to take and defend against any attack from the north. But because they're medium altitude, they don't have as long of a range. And what it does is it leaves significant holes in the missile defense for South Korea. And it's no surprise then that General Scaparrotti, our top commander, has recommended back to the United States that we want to deploy this THAAD system, which would be that umbrella for all of the Korean Peninsula. And that is going to be a contentious issue, not necessarily because of the military side of this, but what is going to happen is that in fact, China has already been talking about this system. They're not happy with it. And so what it appears to do is this is a diplomatic conundrum for South Korea, for the Republic of Korea.
It's like Star Wars, so they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
They are very much caught between the rock and a hard place. So their security partner, their only military ally, the United States, says we have this wonderful system that can come over and offer an umbrella of protection, that one additional layer that could really make a difference if we ever had to fight. They've got their number one economic partner and their number one trading partner saying, we're not very comfortable with this because this is something that could provoke or that could raise the stakes, or we just don't want to see more military weapons on the Korean Peninsula. And so they're in this conundrum. And I believe that how they manage their way through this conundrum will give us a lot of insight into the future of what the Korean people will do as they are. I think they're going to be in more and more of these diplomatic conundrums coming in between the United States and their number one trading partner, China.
So they'll have to walk the tightrope.
I think they will, or thread the needle, some people have said.
You taught me about a Korean proverb that characterizes their country as a shrimp caught between two whales. One whale is China. We've talked about China a little bit. And President Xi doesn't like THAAD, and they're going to have to deal with that. But what about Japan?
Yes.
Which is the other whale. Right. When we left Korea, a leading figure in South Korea said to us, when you go to Japan, tell your friends over there, mind your neighbor. That's right. And they emphasized that their relationship with Japan was never worse.
Yes.
And that's because of this issue of not apologizing for the comfort women during World War II. So what's the story there?
Whoa, it's a big story. Let me start with a historical context because it really helped me as I was thinking through and trying to understand the Korean people, to understand that for years and years and years, they have thought of themselves as this shrimp between two rails. The proverb is, a shrimp will break its back when it gets caught between two fighting whales. That's roughly translated. And what I figured out was that they have always seen themselves as the smaller power between the two big powers. And in the case of Asia, that was China and Japan. And so they have always been at the whim of one or the other and kind of in between, and they've actually incurred quite a bit of attacks as the two big sides have struggled for power on the Korean Peninsula. Now, I found it very interesting that generally when China had dominion over the Korean Peninsula, that was seen as a benign thing. And generally, Korean culture flourished under the dominion of China. However, when Japan was actually exercising its colonial rule over the Korean Peninsula, that was seen as a time of slavery and a cultural genocide.
Genocide. Sadly, we are rapidly running out of time, so I have a question for you. Larry Summers says there'll be reunification within 2 decades. Do you see Korea as reunifying anytime soon?
I hope so. I want it to. I'm afraid that if it is not reunified in 2 decades, maybe even a decade, that window may have forever closed. And of course, I don't see any reason for hope in the near term. Certainly, our President Park has talked a lot about it, and she has done a lot of preparing for it, and mainly just in preparing the Korean mindset for it, which I think is very important for them. But they're one people that have grown apart, and I think that growing apart has been accelerating as modernity has truly reached into South Korea. And companies like Samsung and LG and Hyundai are leading the charge, really, economically around the world, and some of the best manufacturing that there is. I think they are growing apart when it comes to economy, to philosophy, to language and culture. Right now, South Korea leads Asia in things like popular culture or art.
So not anytime soon.
I don't think anytime soon, and I'm afraid that if it doesn't happen, I see the sweet spot in about that 5 to 10 years, and if it doesn't happen then, I'm afraid the window might be closed.
This has been just marvelous, Clint. Thank you so much for coming by.
Great to be with you.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best. Take care, and please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. That was just terrific.
Great.